So without further ado, hello, my name is Scott Balcao, and today I'm going to be presenting an analog for human space training. This is human performance and extreme mountaineering, an analog for our human space training. So my abstract is astronauts use many analog missions to stimulate and train for space exploration travel. There are many more analogs that astronaut trainees can use to train and simulate the harsh environment, both psychologically and physiologically. Mountaineering, I believe, is an analog that would be beneficial to add as a supplement training for future astronauts for deep space missions. I will go back and forth between the Q&A, so if you have questions, I'll keep going on to that. So to give you an idea of some of the NASA analog missions, we have NEMO, we have Hera, and then there's also High Seas, as well as Mars 500. So there are certain analog missions that NASA has used in the past and will continue to use these. And keep in mind, while this is a simulated, an analog mission or a simulated environment, the effects and the outcome are still real. So what you feel and what you experience is still real. It's not simulated. It's not all up in your head. Your body is actually experiencing these certain side effects. So kind of give you an idea of space, harsh environment. You got microgravity, radiation, vacuum, micrometeorites, space junk, particles. And then there's the psychological effects on humans, such as excessive workload, isolation, depression, loneliness, all different type of stuff. So muscle atrophy, big key thing. Mountaineering environment. Mountaineering is an extreme environment that exposes the human body to both hypoxic, a less oxygen environment, and hypoxic, which is reduced pressure. So both of these are key. At an altitude of 30,000 feet, the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere is the same as it is at sea level, but the barometric pressure is about 1/3. Believe it or not, for pilots, when they go above 65,000 feet, they are going above the Armstrong limit. That is the altitude at which barometric pressure becomes so low that the water in your body begins to boil. So that's one of the reasons why U-2 and SR-71 pilots wear partial spacesuits. So next one is an actual graph to kind of give you an idea between barometric pressure and altitude. So as you go up in altitude, the pressure goes down. And then the next one shows a relationship between altitude and oxygen levels. So the depth zone is usually at about 26,000 feet. So about 8,000 meters. And as you can see, pretty much at Everest, it's about 32%. So about half it is, about 1/3 of that from what it would be at sea level. Human body responses in this harsh environment, especially mountaineering, is you have an increase in respiration, your cardiac output increases, your stroke volume decreases. You have to have an increase in red cell production because obviously your body needs more red blood cells to carry more oxygen. Your central nervous system sends signals to maintain homeostasis, and it's also working to retain water and sodium. Sodium is a key ingredient for muscle contraction. So just check real quick and see if there's any Q&A yet. Nope, not yet. Okay. Hold on, sorry. So going on to the body's reaction to hypothermia, a lot of key things that happen in here. So the biggest thing with mountaineering is that the altitude does hurt, but it's the hypothermia that will kill you. Basic rule of thumb is for every 15 minutes you shiver is equivalent to about 1 hour of exercise. It is not uncommon for some mountaineers to lose anywhere between 10 to 15 pounds on expeditions to the Himalayas. So that is not that uncommon. If anyone has any questions, please speak out as I'm talking. So psychological effects of sustained hypoxia. So cognitive function is affected. You have impaired memory, alterations in mood and personality traits, fragmented sleep, effect of stoking and feeling of not getting enough oxygen, almost like you're suffocating. And then this is my own data. I am a mountaineer here in Colorado. So what you see right here is the relationship between my heart rate and the altitude. So as you can see, at first your body senses that you're going up in altitude, so its heart rate has to increase, and then it sort of levels out and says, okay, I've readjusted, I've adapted to my environment, I don't have to work as hard. And these are all the mountains that I've done. This one is the next two are blood pressure. So as you can see, this one is a little bit more erratic. There's no real definite relationship. Same thing goes for the other one. One thing to keep in mind when I'm collecting this data is not every mountain is the same. Some are class 1s, some are class 2s, others are 3 and 4s, some are much longer than others, and then some other ones I do in the summer and other times in the winter. So that does, you always have to account for changing variables when you're collecting data. And then the last slide, well, not the last slide, the other slide from my data is the O2 saturation versus altitude. So from this, you can kind of see that at the beginning, when you go up, your O2 saturation actually will start to go down, and then it starts to jump back up, kind of like it's brain telling itself kick into high gear. So, and then to kind of show a correlation between my data and astronauts in space, you have a time course of physiological shifts associated with weightlessness. So you have neuromuscular, cardiovascular, red blood cell, radiation effects, lean body mass. So there is a point of adaptation, I think within a week and a half, where the body will actually change a little bit to adapt to its new environment. And that's what I'm trying to show in mountaineering as well. Okay, next up, biggest thing you'll face in mountaineering is acute mountain sickness or AMC. You have some of the causes as well as the treatments and the symptoms. I know for a fact that once I get to about 12,000 feet, you'll start to feel the altitude, and that's actually where the timberline is. That's where vegetation will stop growing. I never had any real altitude mountain sickness, but everyone's body responds differently to space. There's no one key formula. Biggest thing to really tackle acute mountain sickness is to stay hydrated and to eat. But if it gets too bad, then the best medicine is just to get down. Unfortunately, if you're doing a Himalayan expedition, you don't always have the luxury of getting down without having to extenuate yourself. So there are some treatments available. So there's dioxamone, which actually helps reduce the swelling in the brain, HACE, high altitude cerebral edema. That's one of the big things when you get into higher mountaineering. And then the Gamow bag, this is kind of like a portable hyperbaric chamber where you actually use a foot pump and put pressure into the bag so that you're actually tricking your body to think that you're at a lower altitude than you are. A lot of mountaineers, if they're start to exhibit symptoms of AMS, they'll go into this for like 6 to 8 hours, and then they're all good to go. Countermeasures to count AMS. So optimum nutrition, diet high in carbohydrates. You burn about 6,000 calories a day. I think to burn 1 pound of fat is about 3,500 calories. So yeah, it's quite a workout. If a proper diet is not maintained, mountaineers could lose 15 to 20 pounds. I mentioned that before. Dehydration is a big thing. Plus, your muscles might begin to cramp up. Sorry. Cognitive function actually does change as you go up in altitude. So as you can see, reaction time actually increases as I go up in altitude. And then from my studies, this is what I use. This is that game Perfection, where you have to put in all those little pieces into the game, and you only got like 60 seconds. So this is the data I collected. And as you can see, from the baseline to the summit, there's definitely a correlation. And even further still, the longer you stay at high altitude, the more it's going to be affected. That one at the bottom, the decacamen, the 4 in a row where I got 25 out of 25. Sometimes if you achieve a goal, you get like a second wind, and sometimes you get like a little sun boost of energy and concentration. That's the only explanation I can come up with that. Just check real here and make sure there's no Q&A. Okay. And chat room. Yeah. Okay. Just checking, make sure. So another thing that mountaineering and space travel have in common is radiation exposure. Exposure to solar radiation increases by 10% for every 1,000 meters. The snow is the biggest thing because it reflects all that sunlight and reflects it right back in your face. And you can get sunburn or even snow blindness. It's just like a giant mirror in your face. So that's one of the key reasons why it's very good to wear goggles, or at least glacier glasses when going up mountains, especially after the winter time during the spring where all that snow is still there. A little bit more about radiation exposure. It can permanently damage your retina and have snow blindness. Almost the same thing. This is more of a treatment. Best treatment is to gradually passive heat with a warm tea bag, so to reduce the swelling. And to go back into the space environment, it has been common for some astronauts where they've actually see little flashes of light in their eye, because that's the photon hitting the retina part of their eye. So some correlation. And then you see the correlation between radiation exposure versus altitude. Once again, as you go up in altitude, more exposed you are to radiation. So me being in Denver, I'm a lot higher. I have been to Leadville, Colorado. So it is pretty high, 10,000 feet. Radiation exposure in space, 3 types of space radiation. You have galactic cosmic rays, solar particles, and then the Valerian radiation belt. Biggest danger from space comes from ionizing radiation. This is the type of radiation that can actually alter your DNA, and you can either suffer from acute radiation sickness or chronic radiation sickness. And there are some long-term effects on this. So this is something that both astronauts and even pilots that fly over the North and South Pole, they monitor very heavily. Mutation. It is not because for the people of Nepal, it is not uncommon that they have a very specific gene mutation that is different from the Chinese. The biggest one is EPAS1. Believe it or not, they've actually done studies and they found out that the mitochondria of the Sherpas, there's fewer of them, but they're much more powerful, much more energy efficient. So that's probably because of the 10,000 years they've had to evolve at the high altitude. The FYI, the Nepal army, they're known as Gurkhas, and they are very good at mountain warfare, probably one of the best. So gene mutation does happen at that high altitude. And to correlate that with space, you all remember Senator Scott Kelly now. He has a twin brother, and they actually did a twin study, and they found out that astronaut Kelly's DNA did, in fact, change from his brother. About 7% of the changes have remained in the 2 years since he returned to Earth. 73% were temporary changes. And another thing they found out is still others involved in the lengthening of telomeres, the caps on the end of chromosomes that help regulate aging process. That was also affected too, the telomeres. So some of the dangers you may experience in mountaineering, an avalanche, very common. It's almost like a river. It's almost like a river of water. And I put a little side note there, just trying to make a little joke while I build a snowman. But these do have enough force to knock you down and bury you. Next up is crevasses. This is why when you travel in snowfields, you always want to travel in team and never alone. And it takes a certain amount of training to not just read the ice, but also to get out of these as well. So next up, brain damage. Believe it or not, prolonged exposure in a hypoxic environment can have irreparable damage on your brain, and actually can form lesions, or most climbers will develop VR spacing. This is something you see more in much older people. So this is something permanent that cannot be changed or altered. The immune system is also affected up in mountaineering. So infections at high altitude is due to an increase in occurrence and persistence of skin and soft tissue bacteria infection. The altitude up there is actually so thin that if you get a cut, it may not stop, because there's not enough white blood cells in your body, because your immune system is suppressed at altitude, just like it's affected in space too. It becomes much weaker. Immune system effects in space, basically the same thing I talked about earlier today. So short-term stress suppresses the immune system as part of the need to divert all resources to cope with the emergency. Lightning injuries is a big key thing in mountaineering. I have heard enough stories about people who have been hit by lightning or get close to it, and it is very scary. I too have come close to lightning. Best case scenario is not to get close to a tree, but to find some type of cave or some type of crop and just bury yourself. Believe it or not, the one thing a lot of mountaineers don't do is they don't put away their trek poles, because that's just a big lightning rod. They'll sometimes have them sticking up in their bag. So key thing in safety. Mountaineering gear, as you can see, this is quite extensive, and it can vary depending on what time of year you're mountaineering, or what mountain you're going up to, or how much redundancy or safety you want. Supplemental oxygen for mountains over 8,000 feet above the death zone, that is definitely a must. And then here's a little picture of some of the gear you'll see. Your biggest companions are going to be the crampons and the ice axe, as well as a helmet. Water purification. Mountaineers depend on physical activity, and altitude may require 3 to 4 quarts or more of water per day. You don't really realize how much you're sweating, because the altitude just evaporates it so quickly, and also because you're wearing layers of insulation. There's actually a sweet zone of how fast you want to go. You don't want to go too fast that you begin to sweat and get hypothermia, but you also don't want to go too slow, otherwise your body's not going to heat up enough. So there is a sweet spot in terms of how fast you want to get up the mountain. So water purification, obviously you have different types of filters. Never drink water straight from a lake without having it go through a filter, unless it's absolutely necessary. So you have iodine solution, or you even have a filter bag. And then we get into isolation. So this is about 32.3 square feet for 2 people at 8,000 feet for sometimes 3 to 4 days. How would you feel if you were that cramped up? So this is also a human factor too, being in close confinements, not having enough space. All in all, in my conclusion, astronauts use a variety of analog missions to simulate and train for space exploration and travel. As astronauts travel deeper into space, new analog missions will be needed to simulate conditions of that environment. Mountaineering is another analog that would be beneficial, as it is an extreme environment that stresses the human body both physically and mentally. This environment will help astronauts prepare for space travel, as they will have to make sound judgments and decisions to both succeed and survive. And then questions, and this is actually me on some of the mountains that I've done in the past. So as you can see, my equipment varies depending on the time of year, but this is all above 14,000 feet.